Sounds great. Well, I want to thank everyone for being with us this morning. My name is Debbie Cox-Bolton. I'm CEO of NewDEAL. Really happy to have you with us for this special webinar meeting hosted by our NewDEAL Forum Democracy Working Group to talk about the state legislative recap as it relates to legislation around the country this year that dealt with voter registration and access to voting. We have a great group of speakers lined up to talk to us a little bit about what happened, both some good things, some things to uplift, and obviously things that we're going to need to watch that are very concerning and dangerous for our country. I was thinking about this event and thinking how apt it is that we're meeting on the 4th of July week, because really, truly, the fight to defend democracy is an ongoing one. This was not written in stone that democracy and freedom were guaranteed for this country, and the democracy, which is the very heart of the American experiment, is something that each generation has to defend and protect. And we're, seeing that all too well right now in our country. So I'm just happy that everyone is here with us and committed to this important work as we go forward. I did want to share that for those of you who are with us in Detroit for our Idea Summit recently, you will know that we did a poll in May that we released at the Detroit Summit, where we asked people about democracy. And it was really heartening, actually, to see that Americans across the country really believe that democracy is still an important issue. It's an issue that they use in thinking about how they're going to vote. They did that in the last election. They say they're going to do it in the next election. And probably most heartening to us was the finding that across party, across demographics, there's a broad swath of Americans who agree on solutions to how to defend democracy. Things like increasing penalties to protect for anybody who threatens poll workers, for example, or expanding voting hours. So the broad support that there is in this country to protect democracy, to defend democracy, is heartening. And it's kind of with that backdrop that I am so proud of the work that the Democracy Working Group has done here with us at NewDEAL. Hopefully all of you know that they released a phenomenal playbook, democracy playbook, earlier this year that had more than 40 very specific ideas that state and local leaders can take right now to expand access to voting, to maintain election integrity, and to increase civic engagement. So I hope you're all seeing that. I hope you're looking at that. There's some really great ideas that you can use in there. I also just want to thank so much the Democracy Working Group for being willing to continue this work. Obviously, this legislative recap is part of that. We're going to be continuing to talk about democracy on our podcast. I will point everyone to the most recent conversation I had with David Pepper, who wrote a terrific book called Saving Democracy, a User's Manual for Every American, where we talked about kind of this long arc of that's necessary to defend democracy. I hope you'll take a listen to that. And for those NewDEAL leaders with us, I will just flag that our Ideas Challenge, which you are all have been invited to submit ideas, one of those categories will be about ideas to defend democracy. And I really encourage you to take advantage of that opportunity. So with that, it is my great pleasure to thank the co-chairs of our Democracy Working Group, Secretaries of State Jocelyn Benson in Michigan, Adrian Fontes in Arizona, Ken Lawrence, Montgomery County Council Commissioner, and a wonderful woman who's with us today, Assemblywoman Sandra Jauregui, who has been made democracy a huge part of her work in the Nevada legislature, and who I will turn it over to shortly. But I want to thank them all for their work, and all of you and the speakers who will be with us who continue to fight this fight every day. So with that, Sandra, it's great to see you, and I will turn it over to you for some opening remarks.
Thank you so much, Debbie. And I'm going to say good morning because it's still morning where I'm at. So good morning to everyone who's on our side of the coast, and good afternoon to everyone who's joining us on the East Coast. I'm Assemblywoman Sandra Jauregui from Nevada. I represent Assembly District 41, and I also serve as the Nevada State Assembly Majority Leader. And it's so great to be here with everyone for this meeting. I think I've missed just one working group, and that was during our legislative session. Other than that, I love participating in these, and I was very honored and excited to participate when Debbie and NewDEAL leaders reached out to me to co-chair this group. And I was coming off of two sessions, the 2019 session and the 2021 session, where I led the Assembly Legislative Operations and Elections Committee as chair and then vice chair. And during those two sessions, we passed some landmark policy in Nevada over those 4 years that really changed the political climate of Nevada for the next decade. And so when I was asked to co-chair, I thought, this is great. I get to brag about all of the good work that we've done in Nevada. And really, for me, I think voting rights and access to democracy are so fundamentally important, and they lie at the core of our democratic foundation. And so I jumped at this opportunity to be able to work with my colleagues across the country to see how we could collaborate and share ideas to continue to improve access to democracy. And that's what this group to me means. And that's what I took the mission of this group to be. And that's why I was excited to join, is that it's really a collaboration of colleagues across the country, across state lines, where we can come together and share ideas, share what's working, what we got done, how we got it done, so that we can then take those ideas and bring them home, bring them back to our home states. I think this is a time where voting rights policy is getting more complex and challenging, that it's really up to us to collaborate and use our collective knowledge and our determination to advance this policy in our nation. Really, the work is going to be done at the state level, not at the federal level. So it's up to us on this call, on these, groups that as we get together to work on this policy. And I actually saw it come to fruition during this last legislative session. I believe it was during the third working group where Senator Chaudhuri came on and talked about some of the work that he did in North Carolina when it came to protecting election workers. And we call them our election registrars or county registrars, those who head the elections in every county. When it came to protecting them and the policy that they introduced in North Carolina to make it a crime to threaten them. And so I was able to take one of the ideas that I learned from this group and bring it to Nevada. And I brought it as an assembly bill, and then our Secretary of State also, Secretary of State Francisco Aguilar also introduced the bill. I called it the Election Integrity Act. Thank you, Senator. And we got that done. And that came from this very working group. So we introduced a policy to make it a crime to threaten election workers and our voter registrars, our county registrars, and to make their personal identifiable information private. I'm sure that we weren't the only ones who saw this in Nevada, but up and down our state, our county registrars were being threatened. Their personal identifiable information, including their family names, their home addresses, their emails, their phone numbers, were being made public, which led to people not wanting to do the job. And so I was happy to see this policy pass this legislative session. And I want to thank NewDEAL leaders because this idea came from this working group. And that's what I hope continues to happen. I hope that we continue to have these meetings so we can share the wins that we accomplish every session. And I know that it's getting more difficult to accomplish these wins, but policy by policy, no matter how small they are, every session that we advance policy, we are doing the job that we were elected to do. We are doing the job that our constituents that we represent want us to do, which is expanding access to democracy, making it easier for them to exercise their most fundamental right, their right for their voice to be heard. And so I just want to say thank you to everyone who continues to participate in these calls, because together we will make sure that we are expanding access. So thank you, Debbie. Thank you, NewDEAL leaders. I'm happy to be here and I look forward to continued participation.
Well, thank you, Representative, for that introduction. Always so great to see you, and thank you for your leadership, certainly of our Democracy Working Group, and of course, making progress for the people in your state. I'm Jonathan Dworkin, Vice President for Policy and Communications at NewDEAL, and I'm thrilled we have such a great lineup of folks to help us understand where we stand as a country in terms of protecting our elections, as 2024, as you can all feel, is fast approaching. So we're going to start with the big picture with Kareem Crayton, who is the Brennan Center for Justice's Senior Director for Voting and Representation, where he manages the organization's efforts to implement pro-voter reforms, combat suppression and intimidation, and push back against restricting abuses. Brennan Center just published a great report looking at some of what's happening across the country, but really helps to dive in, I think, here rather than just seeing it on paper. So Kareem, so great to have you. Thanks for joining us and look forward to hearing your update.
Thank you, Jonathan, and thank you all for the invitation to be here. As Jonathan mentioned, our organization, the Brennan Center, is a part think tank, part advocacy group, but one of the main reasons I think we have a lot of energy in this space is that we do a really good job of tracking a lot of the activity in the states. I'm so glad to hear the comment mentioned. We do believe that a lot of what democracy requires is activity in state legislators, state legislatures. And so we think it's important to track these patterns and to share that information with the public. So we're happy to do that here. As part of our roundup, as we call it, we generally divide legislation into two different categories. They're not perfect, but the descriptions I think capture a lot. We describe voting rights legislation as either expansive, and that's generally described as a bill that contains one or more provisions that make it easier for eligible Americans to register, to stay on the ballot, or cast a ballot compared to the existing state law. Or by comparison, the idea of restrictive legislation that essentially does the opposite, that makes it harder for eligible Americans to register, stay on the voter rolls, or cast a ballot as compared to existing law. We tracked this for a while, and what we see this year is that while it's definitely the case that the continued effort to react, I think, in a somewhat negative way to restrict ballot access after the 2020 elections is still going on. It's decreased somewhat, but it's still near record levels. Our main finding this cycle for the period between January and the end of May was that 11 states, at least 11 states in the country, have enacted a total of 13 restrictive laws. There are 2 states at the time we printed this that were pending, that had legislation pending, but that is actually pretty close to where in 2021, the last year that all legislatures sat and did work, there were, I think, about 14 states at least that passed about 22 restrictive laws. So there is definitely clear movement on the effort to restrict access after the 2020 election, and certainly, and as I'll say in a moment, leading up to the 2024 election. It's not all negative news, to be clear. At least 13 states in the same period enacted at least 19 expansive laws. And what we see really in the country is a somewhat of a divide. It has a very geographic pattern. States that have traditionally tried to restrict ballot access and opportunity to cast ballots are continuing to do that and finding new ways of doing it. Whereas the actors that have intended to expand the ballot have continued in that process and find new ways of doing it. I want to highlight a couple of examples of each and then talk a little bit about some clear trends that we're seeing in this study that should give us reason to be cautious. The first point is to say, and many of you all know some of the activity that has occurred in these legislatures, which focus on ways of restricting the ability of organizing groups to either get people registered to cast ballots or perhaps assist people in the course of actually showing up at the polls. I mentioned there were a total of 13 restrictive bills that passed. It's important to know that 322 restrictive bills were actually introduced in the country during this period. And, you know, as you know, if they didn't pass this time, there's always an opportunity to put them forward later. But I think it's fair to say one of the key actors on the restrictive pattern in the states is Florida, which has, of course, found itself in litigation. But they passed, for example, a rule that limited registration opportunities for groups that would essentially shut out the opportunity to conduct registration drives for any C3 or third-party groups. These obviously are not expansive. They make it less likely for people to register to vote. And so it's therefore characterized in our study as restrictive. Texas is another of those actors. There have been similar bills passed to limit opportunities for casting ballots, both because of mail-in opportunities, but also in the same way, third parties, I shouldn't say third parties, I mean C3 actors, groups that aren't nonpartisan organizations, getting opportunity to assist voters and people who want to register to vote. Those efforts have restricted opportunities, and therefore we've characterized them as restrictive in our study. It's not all bad news, as I suggested. One key trend is the group of states on the positive side that have actually worked to expand opportunity. And here I want to highlight, not just because they're on the talk here today, but Minnesota and New Mexico are two states that have actually expanded opportunity in a meaningful way, in particular focusing on people who have prior felony convictions who have served their time. The new bills in each of those states make it a requirement that people get access to the ballot after they've served their time in prison or a facility. Prior to this time, you had to have completed any kind of supervisory oversight by the state, whether it's parole or the like, before you could be eligible to get back onto the voting rolls. These two bills actually made it more of an opportunity available to more people. And as we know, there is a very disproportionate effect on the population who have prior felony convictions. Often people of color are more likely to have been convicted, and therefore this kind of change would have a positive impact on their ability to cast ballots going forward. A couple of trends to note here, and I don't want to talk too long, but one of the real disturbing considerations that we've seen is the effort by state legislatures to cut off opportunities for direct democracy. And that's really disturbing, of course, because we think that the opportunity for everybody to cast an equally weighted ballot to participate in how they are governed is sort of one of the hallmarks of democracy. And unfortunately here, we've seen states move very solidly against that trend. States that have had this avenue available for direct democracy, Arkansas, North Dakota, and Ohio, have each moved and actually enacted legislation that would make it harder for citizens to use that route to achieve policy aims that they might not otherwise get from the state legislature. And one I want to focus on right now is Ohio, because of course, it is a matter that is actually pending, it turns out, a ballot measure in August, proposed by the state legislature to change the win ratio, that is the necessary qualifying percentage in a ballot measure, to be successful in changing the Constitution. Currently, the law is 50% or more, and the state legislature now wants to change the rule to become 60%. And of course, that significantly increases the odds that a proposed ballot measure is not going to succeed, and essentially pushes more authority unchecked to the state legislature. And many of you all know the fights that have been had about gerrymandering in the state of Ohio. This is viewed by a lot of people, we are among them, as essentially undoing the one opportunity that people have to really push back against legislative overreach, or to, in a positive way, give people the opportunity to define for themselves what the Constitution of their state should read. And so that ballot measure is going to be on for August. Oddly enough, a place where the legislature had said that they weren't going to hold elections. They've now taken a different view about that. But that is, again, a very disturbing trend that we see. The other thing to note here is the trend of criminalizing the ballot box, which is an increasing trend that we've seen that has occurred since the 2020 elections, for sure. And in a lot of states, this has happened in different ways. I'll just highlight Texas and Florida have, as I said before, been kind of the leaders in this area, unfortunately. But there have been changes in Texas, for example, that changed the standard for which a prosecutor would need to prove that there's been an election fraud, if you will, violation by a voter. Current law requires them to prove intent, as most criminal statutes would. This provision actually would remove that requirement. And so that makes it easier, really, for local prosecutors or any prosecutor to basically pass the bar and prove that a person has essentially, in their view, even for a mistake, violated the law. And that obviously has a chilling effect on voters who might not be sure of their status or may need to have extra assurance before they cast a ballot. The other example is Florida, and it has taken a different route, but not any less disturbing, which is, as many of you know, the creation in Florida of this statewide election police unit has very significantly undercut the ability of local prosecutors to exercise discretion, and in many ways concentrated authority within an office controlled by the governor largely to go after people, even for honest mistakes, in exercising their right to vote or registering to vote. And this expanded power raises a lot of questions, particularly where you're thinking about cases where, again, you have a state that has people, because of a state ballot measure, by the way, who are prior people who have had felony convictions, who are now back into the voting rolls and believe themselves to be eligible to cast a vote. But in fact, it may be that the prosecutor in the state office now goes after them and frankly risks them going back to prison for what might be an honest mistake. But the politicization of this process is quite disturbing, and we see it as a effort that seems to be a pattern spreading to other states. But these are all patterns that we need to keep an eye on. As I said earlier, there are about 322 efforts to create restrictive laws. I would say, at least as a high note, I want to end somewhat positively. There are 569 bills that were introduced in the last session in about 49 states to try to expand ballot access. And about a third of them, incidentally, were focused on the idea of expanding mail-in ballot opportunities. And so as we look forward to the 2024 election, I want to just emphasize here that I think ideas to expand opportunity and to essentially protect the people who protect us in our election system are exactly the places where legislation should be focused. And we see that there is some evidence that that is happening. We just want to make sure that we can do everything that we can to support it. Thank you.
Kareem, thank you so much for that. Clearly, as kind of is been happening across the country, there's a push and pull going on. There's good and there's reason for concern, and hopefully we can continue to help promote ways that even have, I think that we found bipartisan support for some positive progress across the country. And happy now that we're going to dig into some specific places where things have been happening on this front across the country. I want to just flag as we move on that if folks have questions, we're going to try to have time. We hope for a little Q&A at the end of the program. You can use the Q&A function for those folks joining us on Zoom to pose your questions. Now I want to introduce Maggie Toulouse Oliver, who was first elected as Secretary of State in 2016. She is focused on providing increased transparency in financial disclosure, campaign finance reporting, modernizing the online campaign finance system, encouraging folks in her state to get registered and to vote, and advocating for good government and stronger ethics legislation. She has particularly, as Kareem referred to, been at the center of a huge push and a huge successful push around major improvements this year in New Mexico. So really thrilled, Secretary, to have you both as part of the New Deal Network and to speak about the progress that you're making.
Thanks, Jonathan and Debbie and everyone on the New Deal team. And thank you all so much for having me here today. It's really a pleasure to be with some amazing colleagues doing awesome work around the country. You know, it's been particularly hard, I think, since 2020 for all of us who care about voting rights and access to the ballot box to kind of see the backlash that's been going on, I think, really, if I'm going to be honest, in response to the outcome of one election. But I also think it's really important, as we're doing here today, to talk about the wins for voting rights and to celebrate those wins and to look and see what's going on around the country. You know, Kareem mentioned Minnesota's great voting rights package that passed this year, which was a huge victory. I know we're going to hear from Connecticut on how they've, you know, they really had to dig in and fundamentally change their constitution to make it easier to vote. So we are seeing these wins around the country, and it's important to celebrate those, you know, even as we are seeing what I think and what I hope, I think what we all hope is a temporary backslide on voting rights in some other parts of the country. But, you know, as Jonathan mentioned, I'm Maggie Toulouse Oliver. I'm the Secretary of State here in New Mexico. I've been Secretary of State here for about 6.5 years. During that time, I've done a lot of things, including I was the president of our National Association of Secretaries of State in 2020 during the election, which was let's just say interesting, also traumatic if I'm being honest, but that's what a good therapist is for, and amazing colleagues and friends. I also, prior to that, served as the county clerk in Bernalillo County, New Mexico, which is the Albuquerque metro area. And I did that job for 10 years. So I was a local election administrator for 10 years, elected. So I'm really familiar with how elections work, both at the state level and at the ground level, managing elections. And, over the years here in my state, New Mexico, I think, has been sort of a traditionally what we would call purple state. Our governor's office goes back and forth between Democratic and Republican. You have a two-term Republican governor, a two-term Democratic governor. We've historically had split delegations to Congress. At one point in recent history, our state House of Representatives was Republican controlled in an otherwise, Democratic government. So, we're not just a traditionally blue state. We are becoming bluer over the years. And certainly right now, if you look at New Mexico, it doesn't get more blue. Every single statewide office is held by Democrats. Every single federal office is held by Democrats, both houses of our legislature. So, keep that in context. But I think too, for us in New Mexico, when it comes specifically to the issue of voting rights, we've been chipping away over the years at improving access to the ballot box. It wasn't an overnight success, and I am going to talk about the bill we passed this year that we're really proud of. But one thing that I think it's important to mention is that, since I have been working in elections, and even let's say a few years before that, we started with early voting, then we went to paper ballots, then we went to vote centers, and then we've, sort of slowly, incrementally made it easier to vote in New Mexico over the years. And one thing that I really want to emphasize is that we have not sacrificed security along the way. We can walk and chew gum at the same time. The idea that if you're making it more accessible to vote, that you're also sacrificing the integrity of the election process is a false dichotomy. And frankly, it's a narrative that I'm tired of, because it's a narrative that's advanced by people who just simply don't want folks to be able to vote very easily. We are able to do things like same-day voter registration here in New Mexico, which we've had in our state now for the last several years, by also making sure that we're processing those voter registrations at the polling place, checking ID, checking it against our voter registration database, making sure this person's eligible to vote, that they haven't already voted in another location in the state. It's not that hard with the technology that we have nowadays. And a lot of the advances that we've made here in New Mexico, for example, our first attempt at automatic voter registration at motor vehicle, online voter registration, those were passed with a Republican governor, a Republican controlled House of Representatives, our membership in ERIC, which is as many of you, probably most of you, all of you know, the Electronic Registration Information Center, the consortium where we're able to share data with other states to make sure we're keeping our voter registration rules up to date. Those were all done during periods of time where we had, again, Republican governor, Republican secretary of state, and Republican controlled House of Representatives. So these are really bipartisan policies. Of course, right now we're at peak polarization, hopefully to move back more towards the middle. Maybe after this next presidential election, we will see. But these are all policies that can be accomplished across party lines, which I think is incredibly important. The bill we passed this year, the New Mexico Voting Rights Act, was an omnibus voting rights package that contained a number of critical measures to expand ballot access. So first of all, as Kareem mentioned, we are automatically restoring voting rights to our formerly incarcerated population. You don't have to go through parole and probation. Most importantly, you don't have to pay your fees and fines, which in my point of view is a poll tax, to get your voting rights back. If you're out of jail, you can register and you can vote. So we're really proud of that. We enhanced our existing, as I mentioned before, automatic voter registration infrastructure, shifting it from you get to choose on the front end whether or not you want to be registered to you get to opt out on the back end. And we're going to be even more inclusive of registered voters with that. We streamlined our absentee voting methods to reflect really what I think is evolving as a preferential shift towards vote by mail in New Mexico. And we created what most states who are all mail states, so Washington, Oregon, California, Utah, et cetera, is sort of the next step, the interim step, which is a permanent vote by mail list. So if you want to always get your ballot in the mail, you can always get your ballot in the mail. Most importantly, I think, well, not maybe most importantly, most notably, we have passed in New Mexico the first Native American Voting Rights Act. New Mexico is a 12% Native population, one of the highest in the country. It's the first of its kind. It is probably the biggest part of this legislation where we acknowledge the sovereign rights of our Native people in New Mexico and the tribes and tribal governments in particular to make decisions and to participate in the decision-making around how, where, and when tribal folks living on tribal lands get to vote. So letting tribal folks use their tribal government building as a place to receive and return a vote by mail ballot, because many of our very rural tribal folks don't have regular postal service where they live. It ensures that our polling locations aren't discriminatory, so that we can work together with tribal governments to make sure that they are being located where they want them and what makes sense for their tribal people. We have given the tribes a ton more input on being able to determine precinct lines and precinct boundaries. Having those precinct boundaries intact is really important for them and protecting their cultural and tribal sovereignty. And lastly, making sure our election infrastructure resources are allocated in a more equitable way, so that our tribal leaders are able to get what they need for their folks. So I'll just wrap up by saying, while other states, as we've seen, have enacted potentially more restrictive voting laws, here in New Mexico, we made the conscious decision to pass legislation that reflects our state's increasing diversity and unique needs. Again, we're home to 23 federally recognized tribes, pueblos, and Indian nations. It's a very rural state. And so we are making sure that, yes, there are still plenty of options to register and vote in person, but also access to that ballot by mail, no matter where you live, is really important. And so it's the culmination of these factors that motivated our state's leadership to consider this voting rights package. Of course, there's not a one-size-fits-all solution. Every state is different. Every state's culture and its voting culture even are a little bit different. But in my experience, working on my state's issues and on national issues, here's a few quick lessons to be learned. First, it's critical for elected leaders to determine where there may be inequities in voting behavior, and even more critical to evaluate why they exist. I know that's a no-brainer for this group, but I think really making sure, drilling down on that data, being really aware of where those inequities exist is absolutely important to be able to drive data-driven legislation. It's important to work alongside communities and in coalition. We would not have passed the Voting Rights Act this year without an incredibly large coalition of so many different folks from different various walks of life in our state that had different concerns and wants and needs and issues. And we're really proud of that. So that coalition building and working together, even though coalitions are not easy, was really important. And then lastly, and this is a much broader lesson that I know everyone on this panel and in attendance already knows, but our legislative success here in New Mexico was born from the acknowledgement that it is the state's responsibility to protect or expand voting rights. And so with that, thank you all again for having me here today. I'm super proud to have been able to brag on my state and have some time, and look forward to answering questions if there are any. Thank you so much. Thanks, Jonathan.
Terrific. Thank you, Secretary. Appreciate your leadership and some great advice for folks, and also the point that I think is important, that there is opportunity even still for some bipartisan progress. We know, as Kareem was referring to, there's a lot to fight back against, but with flag, and we'll stick it in the chat, a Medium piece that we put out just this week, kind of highlighting some trends across the country where we've seen some progress and some of the recommendations the NewDEAL Forum has put forward. And there is some ability to make some progress even in states where you wouldn't expect it. So one other person who's leading certainly progress in his state is Senate Majority Leader Bob Duff in Connecticut. Thrilled to have you, Senator, again on this call. As Majority Leader, Senator Duff has helped the state rewrite its education funding formula, pass legislation on Dreamers, the national popular vote, net neutrality, all kinds of issues. And among the pro-democracy progress in the state, Connecticut recently amended its constitution to support early voting. So, Senator, love to have you talk about that and all other things that you're working on. As always, so great to have you.
Well, thank you, Jonathan. I appreciate it. And good afternoon, everybody. It's great to be part of this wonderful panel and this discussion. It's so important. I'm going to start just a couple steps back at like really high level because it's just top of brain for me right now. I had this really great opportunity over the last few weeks to travel internationally. And one of the things that came out of those meetings and the conversations with officials there is how much people in other countries still look at the United States as a democracy, as the leader of the world, as a place where the right to vote is so important, electing our leaders is so important, and putting in the right policies is so important. And it makes me very proud to be an American hearing those kinds of things, but also it's such a burden of responsibility to make sure that we still work towards having a strong democracy where every vote does count, where people do have the ability to cast their ballot, to choose their leaders. Just the way we are viewed around the world is awesome and inspiring, but also carries a burden for those of us who are elected to make sure that we carry out those dreams that our founders had when it comes to keeping our democracy safe and strong as we always do. And frankly, our number one job as elected leaders throughout this country should be saving our democracy. That is the most important thing that we can do right now because we can't focus on education policy or housing policy or transportation policy or healthcare policy without a strong democracy. So this really is the foundation of everything that we care about, is ensuring that we have good voting rights and people have that ability to choose their leaders and don't get disenfranchised at the ballot box or disenfranchised from being able to share their opinions or share who they want, whether it's based on gerrymandering or restrictions at the ballot box. These are such important issues, and making sure that we continue to have these conversations and elevate these types of things is really important. So in Connecticut, anyway, I'll get into a little bit about what we did, but I just first off want to say too, and I know some other speakers have said this as well, is that expanding voting rights is not a Democrat or Republican issue. Every time we expand voting rights or options or ability for people to cast their ballot, it brings everybody in. And I think there's been studies, for example, we just did early voting, which was mentioned by Jonathan. If you look at the studies, it's not an issue that drives Democratic votes out. In fact, it was used early as the Republican way to drive out votes. But frankly, in the end of the day, you're expanding access, and that really gives everybody the opportunity to do that. And I think that is really, really important for us to have that message. This is not a Democratic issue. It's not a Republican issue. It's an American issue of honoring what our founders wanted by ensuring that everybody has the right to vote. And what we've done over hundreds of years to make sure that everybody truly does have the right to vote, not just some people, which what it was at the founding of this country, that we do give access to everybody who is qualified to vote. So a lot of people think of Connecticut as a blue state, which we are. We have a Democratic governor, Democratic legislature, and in our state Senate, we were 24-12. So we have a supermajority, which is helpful from my standpoint in a lot of ways. But we have some of the most restrictive voting laws in the entire country. And while for many years we have really worked to expand voting access, we had a number of things in place that still make it harder for people to vote, harder than it has to be. And we look at actually some of our some of the states in the Midwest and the West that have been doing early voting or no excuse absentee balloting for decades without problems, and we're just finally getting there. And frankly, I think it was 2016 or 2017. I can't remember the year we did it, but we had a ballot question for folks about expanding to do early voting or no excuse absentee balloting, and it actually got defeated soundly by the voters. They just did not want it because, you know, this is New England and sometimes we're progressive, but other times we get kind of stuck in the mud as to we've always done it this way and we should continue to always do it this way. But when the pandemic happened and voters got a taste of being able to vote early with a absentee ballot, a lot of things changed at that point. And so absentee ballots were mailed to folks, and if they chose to vote that way because they were concerned about COVID, they could vote that way. They could drop it off at a drop box, which we never had in Connecticut. So it kind of these drop box is something that's brand new to us, which probably makes a lot of people in other states think that that's crazy, but it is pretty new to us. So then back in 2022, we had the question about whether or not we should have early voting, and that actually passed finally. And I think that passed again because of the experience voters had here with COVID. And so we just codified the law this year, and we looked at a number of different studies. And I have to just give a shout out to our Senate chair of the relevant committee, May Flexer, and our House chair, Matt Blumenthal, for their work, our Secretary of the State, Stephanie Thomas, who hails from my city in Norwalk, for her work on it as well. But we did it so for 14 days prior to an election, you can do early voting, and I believe it's 7 days before a primary, and then 4 days before a special election and a presidential preference primary. So that's going to be good. We're going to implement it not this year, but next year. And so we just need to give some time for folks to get that up and rolling. And then we also voted again this year in the legislature for no excuse absentee balloting, because again, Connecticut has some of the most restrictive laws, and it's in our state constitution about how you can vote absentee ballot. So we want to remove those restrictions so that and ask the voters to remove those restrictions, and then we can then codify a law based on that doesn't say that you have to be out of town the whole time during the polls are open, or you have to be sick, and it doesn't really define that. Or your physical disability or religious issue. We want to make it a lot less restrictive so that people can do early voting if they want. They can do no excuse absentee balloting, things that other states have been doing for years without problems. Again, you know, back in 2020, we had some of the safest and most secure elections ever, and we've not had issues here in the state of Connecticut as well. So, you know, again, as our previous speakers have said, a lot of these issues about safety and security are not well taken, because we have seen for many years the fact that our elections are safe and secure, and again, we're trying to encourage everybody who can vote to vote. So, and the last piece that we passed was the John Lewis Voting Rights Act that we passed in the state Senate, and then it ended up getting tucked into our state budget as well. And that really just tries to make sure that it requires some of our requires the fact that, or prohibits, I should say, methods that impair a protected class members' right to vote. So if you're a protected class, it makes sure that we don't, that a municipality, because we don't have counties in Connecticut, doesn't take away somebody's ability to vote. It gives the Secretary of the State more powers as well. And then it requires some language assistance if English isn't your preferred language. So again, what we're trying to do is continue to expand voting rights, continue to encourage people who have the right to vote. And again, I think that makes our democracy stronger for everybody. Last thing I'll say, Jonathan, before I finish up here, is just that I appreciate NewDEAL bringing us all together. This is exactly why NewDEAL is so popular, and why leaders come to this organization, is because we get to have these great conversations, these great ideas, and really get to learn from each other and hopefully take the best ideas and implement them in our state. So thanks everybody again. I appreciate it. And I'll hand it back to you, Jonathan.
Yeah, thank you, Senator. Thanks for being here as always, and for both, all your leadership and New Deal of sharing ideas that have been picked up across the network and learning from your colleagues. Our final featured speaker, I think important to have somebody who's actually not from as blue of a state as the folks that we've been hearing from. Chaudhuri is North Carolina's first Indian American state legislator, first appointed to the job in 2016, went on to win election and re-election, previously served as an aide to Roy Cooper, who later went on to be governor, of course, and introduced legislation to protect poll workers and election officials. And as we heard, he is the reason why there is now protections in Nevada for election officials, which is fantastic, and really what this group and what these conversations are all about. And really wanted to have the senator on today because he's always been a leader in this area, but of course, North Carolina has been at the center of a lot that's going on, including the recent Supreme Court decision about the role of state legislatures in elections. So Senator, always good to have you.
Thanks, Jonathan, and thanks, Debbie and the rest of the folks at NewDEAL for organizing this important conversation and also for letting me be part of the democracy working group. It warms my heart that Representative Jauregui was actually able to pass a bill that we introduced here in North Carolina and never got a hearing. But that's the beauty of the network of NewDEAL. I recognize that we're bumping up against the hour, so I'm going to try to be brief and covering two areas. One is the Harper v. Moore decision, and secondly, just talk a little bit about the proposed voting rights and election bills that have been filed here in North Carolina that not surprisingly fall in the restrictive category that Kareem talked about. And it goes without saying, as Kareem knows all too well here in North Carolina, that we are in many ways the epicenter of the battleground for democracy, whether it's gerrymandering and voting rights. And to put things in perspective, I mean, the impact of these bills can really make a difference given the fact that we are the closest state that Joe Biden lost in the 2020 election. He lost this state by a little under 1%. And I think the recent decision by the U.S. Supreme Court in Harper v. Moore illustrates the fact that we're at the epicenter. And just as background, many of you may know that the Republican-dominated state legislature here that included Republican Speaker of the House, Speaker Tim Moore, passed on party line votes and extreme partisan gerrymander to lock in a supermajority of the state's 14 congressional districts. When that map was drawn by the Republicans here, the gerrymander was so extreme that in a state that was evenly divided in the popular vote, it would have given 10 seats to Republicans, 4 seats to Democrats, and a statistical outlier that favored Republicans in more than 99.999% of all possible maps when undergoing a model simulation. As you know, the United States Supreme Court, in a previous case that came from a North Carolina case, ruled that federal courts cannot hear partisan gerrymandering. And so the voters in this instance that actually included my constituent here in Senate District 15, Becky Harper, challenged the contested maps in state court, arguing that these partisan gerrymandered maps violated the state's free elections clause. And then in February 2022, the North Carolina Supreme Court agreed with the voters and struck down the map as egregious and intentional partisan gerrymandering. The Republican legislature here was undeterred and proposed a second gerrymandered map that ended up prompting the state court to order a special master to draw the maps for the 2022 election that resulted in a 7-6 Republican-Democrat congressional delegation breakdown. But unwilling to accept that outcome, the Republicans then asked the United States Supreme Court to step in and reinstate the gerrymandered map based on the reading of the Constitution's election clause known as the independent state legislature theory. And as many of you know already, the proponents of the independent state legislature theory, like gerrymanders, read the election clause to give state legislators near exclusive authority to regulate federal elections, prohibiting any other state entity like state courts or governors from placing checks and balances on that power. As a reminder, our framers actually had great distrust with state lawmakers, so much so when they drafted the elections clause, they insisted that Congress had the power to set the rules for federal elections. In short, if the court had adopted the independent state legislature theory, voters across the country would actually have no judicial remedy, and it would allow voters, allow state legislatures to adopt voter suppression legislation without any checks or balances. And so I think there's a reason that the Harper v. Moore case generated more than 70 amicus briefs, because it really did represent a profound threat to democracy. And fortunately, in this instance, we had a 6-3 court and an opinion that was authored by Chief Justice Roberts that rejected this theory, with Justice Thomas Alito and Gorsuch dissenting. And granted, the court's decision has been characterized, and I think rightly so, as a win for democracy and rule of law and the principles of checks and balances. But at the same time, for those states where there may be a Republican supermajority and where Republicans control the courts, and that would be in places like North Carolina, state legislatures still remain a very real threat to democracy, because they continue to pass laws that work in their favor and limit access to the ballots. And so, speaking of access to the ballots, that really brings me to the second part of what I wanted to share with the group, and that's the proposed voting rights and election board bills that have been proposed here by Republicans. As quick background, Republicans have attempted to push similar legislation in the last 4 years, but they couldn't pass such bills because over the last 4 years, up until this past election, we've had a Democratic governor, Republican supermajority. So obviously now with the Republican supermajority and the political makeup changing, they have a veto-proof majority that allow them to override the governor's veto. Two bills that are worth sharing. Both of these have attracted national attention as well. In the voting rights bill, the bill would eliminate same-day voter registration and replace it with a system that would make these votes a provisional ballot that would also require some kind of follow-up to verify these individuals' identities. And I share that there is this additional verification process that's involved, even though now we have photo identification requirements already in place. In addition, we heard about mail-in ballots in California and Colorado and other states. In this instance, we do see this bill also requiring mail voting to have additional requirements, including signature verification and what's called a two-factor authentication process, which I'm not really sure any of the voting rights experts completely understand how that works. But just to put things in perspective about mail-in ballots in the 2022 midterm, 45% of Democrats here used mail-in ballots and 35% were independent. The second bill to mention is the election board here. Currently, the election board right now is comprised of 5 members, 3 that are appointed by our governor. The new proposal would switch this to an 8-member board with 4 Democrats, 4 Republicans. And the problem with this composition, while it may seem fair on its face, is that it inevitably will lead to a deadlocked board. And I think as anyone can tell you, when we've seen similar impact of the Federal Elections Commission, which also has an evenly divided board, which I think many outside experts would tell you is fairly toothless and ineffective. And the additional problem with the deadlock board here is that in instances where there is a deadlock, these instances would either be resolved by the court or the Republican-controlled General Assembly. We could have instances, for example, where the state board was deadlocked on voting sites and could default into having one voting site for a large county such as Wake County, which I represent, and we've seen similar instances like those take place in Texas. Finally, I should add, with both these bills, there's a fair amount of publicity that was generated by the fact that there was a network of right-wing activists that had met with the Republican lawmakers, including Cleta Mitchell. That was a subject of a Washington Post article that many of you may have read. She is a lawyer for the Trump campaign that has been meeting with North Carolina lawmakers, and in many instances have talked about making voting harder, especially those on college campuses. These lawmakers have also met with members of the Election Integrity Network, which is comprised of groups of election deniers that have also pursuing efforts to make elections more difficult. And so, with that being said, I will say that the election bills here are not one of the 322 restrictive bills that Kareem talked about. because this bill has not passed. I suspect that we will see some version of this bill in the budget that has yet to come out. And so what I would tell folks here on the call is stay tuned. We could see the voting election board bills here actually be worse than the ones I've described so far.
Senator, thank you. As always, thanks for your leadership and fighting the good fight in North Carolina. As we wrap up today, got a great overview, I think, of some individual states and, of course, looking around the country, and would like to just come back to Kareem from the Brennan Center as we close out with big picture as we look ahead to 2024. You obviously are following closely these states and other states across the country. Just what would you say is your biggest concern ahead of next year's, obviously, really important election, and also what makes you hopeful about how it's all going to go?
Well, I'll pick up with where the senator just left off, which is the question about, I'd say, election breakdown, if you will, and somewhat engineer election breakdown. What has me most concerned is the efforts that come from a lot of different states in a lot of different ways to undermine the work of the people responsible for administering and making sure that the votes that are cast are counted and recorded in an accurate way. And whether that goes to the intimidation of our election officials at the polling place or the people responsible in their different folks in different states, counting, reviewing, and approving and certifying those numbers. It's really important that we get that done in a timely way, in a transparent way, in a way that's free from intimidation. And the different ways in which I think a lot of these state laws have created more opportunity for people to meddle with election management concerns me. On the other hand, I would say the thing that makes me quite hopeful is the point I mentioned earlier of bills that didn't pass. There's more energy on the side of both, actually, on the bills that were proposed and the bills that were adopted this term, on the side of expansion. And I totally agree with the view that's been expressed. There is a lot more energy, even if it's not top of mind for a lot of people. There's a lot more energy about ways of improving access to the ballot box than there is on the other side. The other side's louder sometimes, but I think the idea that you can reach a lot of people no matter their political affiliation on the basic notion of our democratic system requires everybody to be involved, and it should be our responsibility as the state to make that real and to remove barriers for it. That, to me, makes me hopeful. And if there's a lot more energy around creating new ways of making that possible, I feel like, as we have learned in this pandemic, we've had to discover important ways of reaching out and finding people where they live, literally all of us in our homes, to make sure that we keep our democracy going. I think that's going to continue, and it keeps us hopeful. And it's one of the reasons we are going to remain a resource and being helpful to many people as we can around the country to be, identifying those ways of expanding opportunity and actually trying to see it through in enacted legislation.
Well, thank you, Kareem, for that. And we look forward to continue to working with you on just that, and just appreciate all of your help in this conversation today. Thank you, of course, to all the New Deal leaders who spoke for your remarks and your leadership. I'll close just with a couple of last notes. One, for more information on what we are recommending for states and localities to be doing, go to our website, newdealforum.org. We've got our playbook up there and a bunch of other information. A couple of notes just for folks in the New Deal network. As Debbie mentioned at the beginning of the call, we are in the middle of our ideas challenge. Please submit your best ideas for consideration to be recognized at our conference this fall. And speaking of our conference, just mark your calendars for November 15th to 17th here in Washington, D.C. So with that, just thanks to everyone for being on, and we look forward to talking with you again soon.